It's called Boiling the Ocean, this talk, and it's, you know, quite often I have a bit of a sort of reputation sometimes of being a little bit kind of Yoda-esque and kind of being a bit philosophical. You know, there's a lot of presentations around, you know, how to run your business or your product or your service faster and your teams more efficient and all that kind of stuff. But I actually think it's also really important to spend some time to think about some things. And I have another talk, I'm going to take some water. I have another talk where I kind of talk about this quite a lot, about sort of being a bit more mindful in what we do. The Yoda thing here is that I want you to kind of think about the fact that everything is connected to everything else. You know, we share our atoms. I read a thing the other day that they reckon that everyone has about 1 billion of Shakespeare's atoms in their body, in their own body. Probably also means kind of Hitler and Genghis Khan as well. Sounds like a lot. If you line them up next to each other, they wouldn't, you could hide them with a human hair. The point is, though, that, you know, we make these artificial divisions that aren't actually real. You know, the thing about that inner place that you think of your mind, that's your most kind of internal space, it's just part of my external kind of physical reality. And in fact, it's all about external realities. So we're not the separate beings that we think we are. So what does this all have to do with design? We live and work in ecosystems. And here's an ecosystem here. But this is an ecosystem you might think it is. Okay, these are not flowers, and this is a drone shot above a share bike graveyard. Right, so all of those things you just saw are discarded share bikes. They're all part of the digital disruption of public transport. And you know, the thing is about that model, of that kind of startup model of scale and launch fast, is that most of the time we're kind of thinking at this level, right? And we as designers, you're often thinking around this level of the actual touch point, the customer experience, what we're actually using and so forth. But in that kind of VC funded world, what you've got is a situation where you're, it's being fueled without any of the kind of natural barriers that you'd normally have, right? So, which is one of the things, is we don't have enough money to scale that quickly. Instead, you're kind of burning VC money to do so. But as you know, when you kind of, it puts those things on steroids. And as you know, that kind of excessive growth, oops, I've just gone too far. That kind of excessive growth has consequences, right? When you overdo something and you have massive kind of growth artificially, whether it's, you know, bodybuilding, or whether it's through the VC funded growth that I was just talking about, or when you're kind of thinking about, you know, over fertilization. All of those things have side effects, and they're not separate from each other. Intensive farming, I'm not vegetarian, but, you know, intensive farming, these are actually quite kind of happy chickens. But in general, if you think of sort of intensive farming, it's all about kind of trying to extract as much out of the natural kind of ecosystem as you possibly can. And there's been quite a lot of reports that, and studies around that this is quite possibly one of the reasons why coronavirus has kind of arisen, and we can expect more because we keep doing this. That, of course, is connected to this, which is, as we consume, all of those atoms and molecules, all that stuff, all the detritus of consumption has to go somewhere, right? And it you know, goes in our bins, it goes in our recycling if you're in Germany, if you're lucky, or it just might get dumped at the side of the road. So, you know, all of those atoms go somewhere. Most of them stick around as stuck together as stuff for a long time. Some of them break down into molecules, and as you know, also microplastics, and then into molecules, and leach lots of very nasty molecules back into the ecosystem that eventually ends up in our bodies. And right now, for example, disposable face masks, right? I see them all over the place in car parks and in the street and stuff here in Germany. Each one of those takes 450 years to decompose. And there's a lot of them ending up in the oceans at the moment. And all of that is, of course, related to this. This is one of the many Black Lives Matter marches. And as I'm sure you know, many of the people of color have found themselves, particularly in America, probably also in Australia and the UK and other places, found themselves are at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. Right? And it's yet another burden that they have been hit hardest by coronavirus. It's yet another burden of that structural discrimination. And many of them, because many of them are in these frontline jobs, they can't afford to take the time off of in the States where they might not have healthcare. You know, and all of those jobs are, of course, are driven by the same philosophy, which is about trying to extract as much as you possibly can out of a system in order to grow at an unnatural pace, and in order to shift vast amounts of wealth upwards, usually at the cost of those at the bottom end of things. So, you know, you can't kind of separate all of those things out. They seem separate when we talk about them, but it's also related to this stuff, not just Facebook, but of course, you know, the internet in general and social media, and the media in general, and big money in the media. And there's this toxic relationship between those and politics, which kind of act like this kind of stuff on steroids. So conversations that might have been more civil, conversations that might have had to been face-to-face, conversations that might have meant more research or looking into something before you just share it, like a kind of virus. You know, we talk about that stuff going viral. This stuff is like steroids for all of that stuff I just talked about. And of course, that is related to this. And on it goes, right? So you have this situation where you've got all of these things, there's systems within systems, and within systems, it makes this very, very complex ecosystem. Back on the design level of things, you know, it's really important to remember that no interface works without an ecosystem, and few sort of products today are standalone. So Sonos is obviously a physical product, but it's also a whole service system, right? So when Sonos, and I don't know if many of you saw this, Sonos did a thing, I can't remember what it was, a few months ago anyway, where they said, we're upgrading our operating system and will no longer be supporting your old Sonos devices, speakers. Now, of course, you know, they spent their whole thing training people to build up your ecosystem of Sonos devices. And they said, no, but what you can do is put it into recycle mode. And what recycle mode does is just, it turns it into a brick. Right? And so it can't be resold under the auspices that, you know, the legacy products, you know, if they get passed on, people wouldn't experience the Sonos experience they're supposed to be experiencing. But of course, you know, you turn something that's perfectly working into a brick, and I can guarantee that very few of them would have actually been recycled. They would be very, very lucky if half of them got actually recycled, but they won't be refurbished, which is one of the things they could have done, is say, okay, well, we'll replace part of the chipset on it. So they sort of half reversed their decision on this. But the point about this is it's not complicated. It's complex, and there's a really important difference between those two. And when you're dealing with complexity, you know, when you're designing with this, you need to design simultaneously for those details and that human behavior, as well as the kind of big picture, and go back and forth between them. But some things really are complex. Climate change, Brexit, you know, systemic structural racism and discrimination, all of those things are complex. And so sometimes you actually need to boil the ocean. Right? And this is this classic thing, I've heard it loads of times, had it leveled at me loads of times, which is, you know, when you're designing something and you're kind of laddering up, and at some point someone says, well, you know, we don't want to boil the ocean though, let's just kind of focus down. The temptation of that is to make something detached from its actual complexity. So here's a diagram that I've been using for years. I came up with it for a talk I did called Design to the Power of 10, which is where the podcast name comes from. 6 years ago, 7 years ago, I think around sort of 2014, I first did it. You know, I mean, it crept into Fjord's go-to-market stuff as well, which I've had to rebuild this slide now because I obviously don't have the stuff anymore. But the idea behind this is that designing for exponentially nested ecosystems requires tackling that complexity head on. Right? You can't take it apart like you can a product, a physical product like a car or something, and pull it apart and into its bits and then put it back together again, because you detach the complexity. And zooming between layers is the way I kind of think about it. So at one level, you might have a single touch point, right? And that's living inside a multi-channel service. So, and in that multi-channel service, there's many, many touch points, many channels, including people. That in itself is living inside a business ecosystem or ecosystems where there might be multiple services or competitors and so forth. And that is living inside, or those are living inside a PESTLE. So political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal ecosystems, right? All of which are massively complex in their own right. So every time you go up, the sort of complexity becomes exponential. And I've done this neat slicing of these, and of course, that's not what it really is, right? This is much more of a continuum from bottom to top. The journeys people take through it are much, much more messy than just kind of some kind of linear journey. Quite a lot of the kind of discussion, debate, argument, disagreement, and misunderstanding and misalignment that happens with project teams, with stakeholders, with clients, and so forth, and in politics too, is people talking at cross purposes. So someone's thinking at kind of one of these levels, and someone else is thinking at the other level, but they think the other person is at their level, and they're having a big argument about it. You know, and that's often where you get things where the idea that some bit of sort of CX work might kind of change the whole world or change the whole business without changing any of their structural kind of business. It's the same reason why just changing, I don't know, just putting out a statement about racial diversity isn't enough if you're not changing some of the structural stuff as well. So you have to kind of tackle that stuff all at the same time. So if we fail to tackle complexity with complex thinking, you're doomed to oversimplify and produce simplistic solutions that fail. I wrote a whole kind of piece about this, which you can go and read. I found a weird source for a kind of interesting view on this. There's a guy called Jakob Lund-Fisker, and there's this whole movement about early retirement extreme, and it's all about kind of doing a lot more things yourself and spending less money when you're younger and saving much more so that you can retire early. But his approach to it, which I found really interesting, was he takes a kind of systems view of the whole thing and looks at kind of how all those things interact. And so the beginning of the book is all about kind of deconstructing that system. And one of the things he kind of talks about is why we find that so hard and why we end up sort of on the kind of treadmill of, you know, of a job and think, oh, okay, I'm going to save for my retirement when I go, and only a little bit, but most of the time I'm just spending my money and it scales up, is that non-linearity is inherently much harder to deal with than linearity. And he says, in fact, a tremendous amount of effort goes into linearizing problems to make them seem understandable and solvable. But what happens is the solution to the simplified problem isn't the solution to the original complex problem or systems problem. And not only that, you miss out on the opportunities and the richness of possible solutions. I just found a really good summary of what happens all the time with this stuff. And it happens a lot in our work and in service design. So any of you have read anything by Noah Yuval Harari, this will be sort of obvious to you, but the thing to remember is things that we feel are really solid, like money and borders and countries and laws and markets and all of those kind of social norms. They feel so concrete, and fixed, but they were once designed, or they've been kind of created over time, which also means they can be redesigned. You know, at some point in time, a few hundred years ago, it was acceptable to own another human being, right? And now it's not. So all of those things can shift. So I want to go to some sort of practical examples of this. One is one that I've used a lot of times before, which is about how disconnected touch points, so how the detail, that's bottom level of Zoom, can wreck an ecosystem. And it's one from Australia, it's one from Melbourne. Hello, Melbourne folks. Now, this is from a little while ago, so it's a bit unfair. So if anyone's from Public Transport Victoria, I apologize, but it's such a good example. So when PTV, Public Transport Victoria, started their touch card payment system, ticket system, they talked about it all the marketing was about touching on and off. So it looks, yeah, okay, that looks great. Except then that didn't work. And so you start to have all of these, so sort of extra crappy signs or labels on things, especially handmade ones, are a sign that something didn't work when they kind of put it out in the world. And these are kind of kludges to try and fix it. So there's these signs around the place. So don't tap. Oh, okay, I don't tap. What about, so I swipe it a bit? No, you don't do that. Or maybe it's one of those things where I kind of wave in front of it. No, don't wave either. The machines themselves, the card readers, they had quite small displays. And as you know, in the Australian sunshine, it's quite hard to read that stuff. It became a sort of object of hate, so they got vandalized a lot. The amount of credit you had sort of left on your card was shown to you in like a kind of millisecond, and it was very difficult to know when you had money or not. You go to the machine, you go to the top-up machine. Again, loads of kind of vinyl labels all over this. Clearly, the actual kind of flow of the machine isn't very intuitive at all. And the screen itself kind of looks like a PowerPoint slide. When you go to the Yarrow tram tips, I'll read this out because it's kind of worth just considering how this comes across. So this is supposed to be helping you, right? And this is old now. I'll explain why at the end. When you travel with Mikey on a tram, you don't always need to touch on and off at the end of your journey. That's because you can now travel from one end of a tram route to the other on a Zone 1 fare. Okay, all right. On 3 tram routes, 75, 86, and 109, at the ends of the line furthest from the city have a short Zone 2 section, brackets, which overlaps with Zone 1. Okay, I'm already a little bit confused. If your tram trip is entirely in Zone 2, you must touch on and off to get the lower Zone 2 fare. Otherwise, there's no need to touch off on a tram. By which time I really don't actually know what I'm meant to be doing. And on top of that, it requires you to actually have a pretty good knowledge of the zoning system and where stuff goes. And as someone's just written in the chat, you know, as a tourist, I had no idea, right? This happens all the time. It's not just, Zurich is like this too, and there are quite a lot of places in Switzerland like this. The human result of this is that people are kind of just tapping, and partly because they were very draconian about finding people if you didn't have your card enough credit, but they also, you know, so the inspectors come on, you can pay them immediately, right, with the FPOS machine. But if you try and top up your card at the beginning of this, it took like 5 to 7 days to top up your card with a credit card. I think it's quicker now. So the human behavior is someone just tapping and tapping and tapping, not sure what they're doing, and it slowed everything down. You know, they're standing in the stairway, trying to get off the tram. Everyone else is behind them. All the traffic is behind the trams because trams block the traffic in Melbourne. And so the whole thing actually starts to choke up the city. I went to the website and I kid you not, because look at the URL. I went to the website to try and work out what this was, and I got a 404. Part of the problem was slow card readers, right? So the tap on and off or touch on and off, you can't do that, right? Touch, hold, and go. So you've told people a whole bunch of behaviors that they should do in one touch point, and then the other touch point doesn't actually accept that kind of behavior. And so you're having to kind of fix it up with a sign. And this ends up costing quite a lot of money. So this was back in 2016. There's quite a lot of things that the budget when it blew out from 340 million to 1.5 billion, there's quite a lot of things you can do with that money. It happens the other way though too. So major shifts at the top level of Zoom affect all the details. And I didn't ever have a kind of really great example of this. I used to use the sustainability thing quite a lot and recycling for this. But we've got a fantastic example that now everyone knows, which is the smallest level of Zoom, this tiny little virus, the coronavirus, has had this massive effect at the biggest level of Zoom. And so what's gone on there is that you've had, at the human level, all those things that we took for granted, suddenly we can't take for granted anymore. And you remember me saying all those things that seem like they were kind of all concrete and very clear, they're actually not. And you know, you can change them. And what was remarkable about the coronavirus and the kind of lockdown that's still going on about it was how quickly a lot of things changed. So, you know, whether it was going shopping, whether it was supply chain logistics, which is a kind of another level up, you know, and everyone going, but the human behavior of, for some reason, everyone buying toilet roll, which a behavior I still don't understand, through to kind of wearing masks, through to kind of being able to, you know, 3 small things: keep your distance, wash your hands, wear a mask. And those kind of 3 small behaviors kind of also helps unlock a lot of what had previously been locked up, because kind of all sorts of things started to stop. And in fact, at some point then the world was temporarily closed. So how do you boil the ocean? Well, the answer to it is slightly facetiously, you know, when you think about the kind of problems that you're dealing with here, and it feels like all of those things are kind of out of your scope, right? It feels like I can't possibly do anything about this. But as you saw with the coronavirus thing, there's lots of small things you do, and lots of those small things start to kind of change the ecosystem. And with coronavirus, some of it was for the worse. So, you know, people who are in, particularly in the arts, so if you're anywhere where people gather, you know, so if you're cinema, theatre, musician, in sports, you see, you know, a lot of things kind of close down because those small things you can kind of, those small changes started affecting everything. But there's also a lot of things that you started to be able to do, and you really kind of see that relationship between the two. So the thing is about all of those is they're systems, right? And there's a wonderful lot of thinking around this. There's a woman called Donella Meadows. She was one of the 3 authors of The Limits to Growth, which is a very kind of famous book about looking at systems. One of the kind of first books or publications that was really looked into this idea of applying kind of systems thinking to the world and to global economics. And then I think every designer should read this book, and certainly any service designer should read this book, because she talks, I'm going to come quote from it and talk about it quite a lot, but she talks about these different ways of kind of approaching systems and looking at systems. And one of the things she talks about is this kind of abstraction of things as well. So she has these kind of models of systems, you have kind of inflows and outflows, and you have these kind of feedback loops. You know, one of the things to remember is that all of those things are abstractions. And at some point, you know, when you're doing a drawing of that or a diagram of that, you've got sort of inflow, but you're not kind of mapping it to where it's really going, which is there's some other kind of inflow and the outflow goes somewhere, hence the kind of thing about the kind of waste. But a key thing around kind of systems thinking is that a small shift in one thing can produce big changes in everything. And one of the things they did in the Limits for Growth is they really examined this one thing, which is growth. But she said, you know, growth has costs as well as benefits, and we typically don't count the costs, right? Among which are poverty and hunger, environmental destruction, etc., and the whole list of problems that we're kind of trying to solve with growth. And so what's needed is actually, and they were saying this I can't remember when the original book came out, I think it was the late 70s, you know, what's needed is much slower growth, and much different kinds of growth, and in some cases, no growth or negative growth. And so, you know, the world leaders they're correctly fixated on economic growth as the answer to virtually all the problems, but they're pushing with all their might in the wrong direction. So one of the things, you know, that was pushing for growth. And one of the things in systems thinking is quite often the thing that helps you get somewhere, which is you can kind of push on that lever and it actually has a positive effect. If you keep pushing on that lever, it flips over into having a negative effect, and it can go into this kind of feedback loop really quite quickly. And, you know, and so hence my comment at the beginning, or my example at the beginning about sort of share bikes and scooters. On the one hand, they can be a fantastic personal transport alternative, right? And they can fill that last mile gap. There's lots of things that are very positive about all of those. But if you just keep pushing for growth and growth and growth and growth and growth in those without the attendant kind of, without taking care and looking at what are the other parts of the ecosystem, then stuff starts to go wrong. So in many cities, they were suddenly overwhelmed. There's all these scooters around on their streets and bikes around their streets. They're not really integrated in part of the transport infrastructure. In some cases, cities who had limited budgets just kind of went, okay, well, we'll just let, you know, private enterprise deal with this. In other places, cities said, no, we're going to kind of actually integrate this better and make this and work better, have policies and laws and so forth about it. But there was a lot of kind of tension there. On a side note, the average lifespan of one of those e-scooters in, you know, like a Bird or whatever it is 3 months. So if you think of all the materials that go into one of those and the battery and so forth, that stuff just doesn't last very long. It goes somewhere, and it goes usually to a tip in China. So when we think about kind of pushing on stuff, when we think about pushing on those small things that make a big difference. Another really good example we have is this, right? So is social distancing. And it's such a great example to kind of think about and use this. So those small changes make a kind of big change. And all of the stuff that the spin-off did in New Zealand was really fantastic around kind of explaining some of those things, same as the kind of flattening the curve thing, to get the idea, because most people really struggle to get their heads around this and the exponential growth. And now we kind of have a really good example of it. So now imagine if you do that with a racist comment, or you do that with some structural hiring practice that discriminates, or maybe it's around circular economy principles where some of those materials flow back in. And then you start to see why those small things really kind of escalate, because it's actually lots of small activities. It's lots of what I call sometimes lots of small acts of mindlessness that go into creating that problem in the first place. And so the undoing of it is often lots of small acts. I don't know how I'm doing for time. I'll stop in a second anyway. So one of the things that Donella did was to put together a kind of list of places to intervene in a system. And I'll kind of summarize this, because I'll let people go back and have a look at it. I'll put this up online later. That you've got these, and in the increasing order of effectiveness. Now, a lot of the time you're down, people's desire is down at kind of number one there. It's just transcending paradigms, which is like, we need to change everything. And that's when you get the boiling the ocean conversation. But actually some of the stuff earlier off is, well, you know, what are sort of parameters, numbers, small things that you can change, you know, taxes, subsidies, those will kind of have big changes. The sizes of kind of buffers and stabilizing stocks. So there's this idea of stocks and flows. So if you imagine a reservoir's got a certain amount of water in it and there's a certain amount of flowing out of it. If you change either the size of the reservoir, how much flows, change the amount of consumption. And then things like delays, this is really true of business, length of delays, rate of system change, there's lots of little things you can change there, sometimes shaving off. There's one project I worked on, shaved off 12 minutes off of kind of the average technician's job for a telco. It ended up saving them $4 million a month. Right? And then looking at those kind of feedback loops, and then gradually you start to kind of look towards changing the rules of the system, looking at who's kind of included and excluded, changing power systems. Eventually you get to kind of the transcended paradigms. The ones down the bottom there, or the, you know, the lower numbers, are the hardest to do. The ones kind of further up, but they have less immediate scale impact, but they're often things you can do. And the point is you can do a mix of them. If anyone knows John Colco's book, Exposing the Magic of Design, it's about design synthesis, he actually talks about this Zoom level thing. And I can't remember, I'm pretty sure I was also talking about it before I read it, but I completely give him credit that he may have seeded that in my brain, and or that we've just come to it at the same time. But you know, it's important to kind of credit your sources. So anyway, when I was rereading it, I was thinking, oh, I used that. And then I noticed he was also talking about the powers of 10 thing. I thought, I don't remember that. He talks about this idea of a semantic zoom, and he uses a toothbrush in this case, where you have a product and then you've got a kind of a feature or the function when you kind of zoom in, and each time you're zooming in, basically you end up with this kind of situation where you've got control or UI elements, so, you know, the brush handle, as it were, and an attribute or a detail, which may be, you know, the brush, what do you call them? The bristles. It may be to specific polymers and stuff in that bristles. And then you go out the other way and you've got a kind of product brand, a line or brand, you've got a company or marketplace, and so going to global and world.
I have a question, Andy. Andy, what is one of the biggest frustrations in regards to service design and trying to apply this logic in an organization, especially when you have to consider the many levels?
Is that the organizations themselves are not set up that way, to think that way, you know, and it's the reason is because most organizations, so modern management that's been around for, sort of, say, the last 150 years is sort of arose at the time of the Industrial Revolution, right? Because before that you had sort of artisans creating stuff. And so as you started creating factories and started breaking down something that's really complex into small component parts that you can, you know, unskilled labor can do, right? That was the whole point of it. And the assembly line, then what starts to happen is that split between the people who are making the things and the feedback they get from both themselves and the customers, and management, right? Because management are supposedly there to kind of to be the ones who are so smart that they kind of put it all back together again. And so most sort of management and most organizational structures and company structures are built on that model. And so you still kind of have that separated thing where the person at one end of an organization in one department doesn't have to really know or even know of or know what that other person is doing in another part of the organization, because management is supposedly kind of bring it back together. And of course, so what happens is that services that are created in silos, or at least silos that are separated from each other, they're experienced by customers in bits. But then at the other end of things, when we think about sort of structural inequality or climate change and sustainability, it all kind of washes out at the other end because that part of the whole cycle isn't thought about at all. So my frustrating thing is that you can do some of this, but it's very, very hard to do it if an organization is very kind of fixed and is not in a position to start changing the way they're structured, because you can't do things differently if you keep doing it the same way.
When you've found resistance to change from multiple stakeholders in complex organizations, problem spaces, what have you found useful in your toolkit to begin that conversation around real change and actually start the momentum?
So there's two views of this from either end of the Zoom level. One is, that classic kind of Gandhi thing of be the change you want to be. I think it was Gandhi, which is you start changing some of the things that you're able to change. And so what can often happen is you start changing something that you're able to change, and that creates a ripple effect to other stuff that's connected to it. And, that's the systems thinking kind of view of this. If you get enough of that going on, then you actually get some real systemic kind of organizational change. And when you're in a sort of design leadership position in particular, or even sort of a bit lower down, 90% of your work is not design work or problems, it's kind of people wrangling, right? And so some of that is to not talk about design or service design specifically. So some of it's actually to talk about things like risk or things like purpose or those kinds of things, to think about, well, why are we actually doing this? A lot of the time it's about trying to kind of work your way back up to some decisions that you're currently now experiencing. And it's a classic sort of 5 whys, ask a lot of questions kind of thing. I've had I'll give you an example. So I've had an organization ask if I could teach 3,000 of their staff design thinking, and it was a bank, right? So I was kind of, my first question was, what's the intent behind this? What would you hope? Let's imagine we've done it. How do you hope things will be different afterwards? And by asking that kind of question, you actually get back to the original intent. And often, as ever, you explore the problem space slightly differently, and that means you can kind of go at it a slightly different way. And so, if your intent is that, then actually this and this needs to be done. So there's one of the ways to expose that the kind of quick fix is not as quick as people think it is. Invariably, and the reason why it's quite good to do this kind of exercise that we just did as a group, and a diverse group, is because everyone starts to see that, oh, it's much, much more complex than my narrow view of it particularly was. And that's quite important, right? That's really important to try and get people to really understand that this is a complex problem and not just a little thing that we can do.
What I'm getting as well, if say, for instance, the people that here were to use a map like this and say it was around a particular service, because I'm getting a couple of questions around where to begin, how do we visualize it? I suppose taking people through that journey, like, we wouldn't necessarily present 10 nodes or whatever. We'd start with, let's look at the customer experience here. What are we influencing? What direction? And then slowly work outwards, going down a micro level, or depending on the people in the room, we'd go up at a macro level. Would that be your approach?
Yeah, I mean, it will, if you're not careful, it will kind of frazzle people too much, and you'll get the kind of boiling the ocean thing. Don't boil the ocean thing leveled at you straight away if you kind of present the whole thing. So I think there's a few ways where you can use it. One is, before you start a project, so there's another thing called territory mapping, which is basically a kind of affinity cluster map where you just try and get everything you can think of to do with that. And again, diversity is really important. And I really mean it in every single sense of diversity, of, for gender, race, everything else, as well as you know, department and skill and so forth. The more people you have contributing, you know, their little kind of lens on the world to the whole thing, you suddenly, you get a sense of how it all connects together. So doing any of that at the sort of kickoff of a project is really good to really understand, you know, are these the droids we're looking for? You know, is this the problem? Is the problem that we're looking at really the problem that we want, you know, should be looking at? It's useful for scoping out research, for example. So if you're doing discovery, you might want to ask people around, you know, I don't know if there's, let's say we take the scooter thing, you'd want to ask people about other behaviors of transport, but you might also want to ask them about their views around sustainability or recycling or anything, because it might kind of have an influence to the way you build those scooters and the service. So, you know, that helps shape the stuff you look for, because if you're not looking for it and you don't ask the questions about it, none of that ever flows back into the kind of concepts and the work. Right? And then I think at the other end, whenever you're, you know, design is a process of making decisions, right? And so whenever you're making a decision, it's really important to think about the kind of broader ecosystem of, you know, who are we excluding, who are we including, what are the, there's a thing called red teaming, where you basically, a sort of ethical design or development thing, where you basically just try and, you get a group of people who try and nefariously break and think about all the ways they could abuse your system and service. And it's really good to regularly do that, because it happens all the time as soon as you put stuff in the world, right? So, you know, one of the things around that is, you know, you go through that process for the touch points and start to think about, you know, what unintended consequences are there. So it's a useful thing to do at kind of different stages of a project. You don't necessarily want to be doing it all the time, but I think it's also very useful for people to have that kind of map in the back of their head or on the wall.
And just you know, on that, Shane from Amsterdam asked, do you connect this with jobs to be done as well?
One of the nice things about jobs to be done, and I was a massive skeptic of it actually initially, and a part of my argument is jobs to be done is why products in the digital products world are actually services, because actually what jobs to be done is about reframing a product into a service, right? But the nice thing about it, and the thing that Jim does really well in his book, I'm just seeing if I've got it here, is, you know, you can apply it at lots of different Zoom levels in the organization. And we talk about that a bit in the podcast. And so I think it's quite powerful for that. I think you do have to be a bit careful of, like, you know, when you've got to hammer everything as a nail, and not just apply every method to everything and understand. And actually that's one of the things, which is to understand which methods work better at different levels of Zoom. Because I'm not saying you get rid of UX, I'm not saying you get rid of UI design, or in the same way as I'm not saying you get rid of material scientists and so forth. You need those different people coming in at different points, but you also want to try and make sure that you're thinking about how it hangs together.
Awesome. And somebody asked a lot earlier, are there any books that you'd be recommending apart from the ones that you mentioned, but like people?
There's probably more on. There's a load more kind of systems thinking. The Donella Meadows one is, I think, like one of the kind of best books. There's another one called The Fifth Discipline, and he's a very famous author, and I can't remember the name. Probably loads. I'll have to kind of think about it, I think. I mean, I don't know if anyone's read Frédéric Laloux's Reinventing Organizations. For the organizational change stuff, I think also Aaron Dignan's Brave New Work is really good too.
All right. That's fantastic. Andy, thank you so much. We've gone a little bit over. And I think there's been some real gold here. So I just want to thank Andy for sharing this evening. I'd also like to thank everyone for joining us.